money metrics, debt, and physical flows of something, nature, energy, what have you, in the economy. So this is some work I've been doing with someone who'll be here later, Eric Benedict, and a postdoctoral fellow, Bello Capone, who's working with me on this. So this is essentially a discussion of a macroeconomic model to try to link these together. The question I had was, what's the quote-unquote simplest model I can make that would link resources, debt, and people and economic variables that people are interested in, such as wages and profits and these basic kind of metrics of the economy. So the goal of this model is really to have something that can help us play games to say, is the finite Earth affecting socioeconomic variables, mostly economic variables? What pieces would I need to be able to explain these phenomena? And basically, how simple of a model can you make to explain these? Turns out, maybe it's not as simple as I'd hoped, but I'll show you what I've been working on and show you some of the results that I think are fairly compelling, at least at this stage. So the idea of comparing this to historical data as a broad check is really what I'll be talking about in this presentation, which is, would I know if the model is doing something realistic? And the main thing that I want the model to be able to do or to demonstrate is to be able to characterize with some number of variables the broad transition from an agrarian to fossil-based society, or an industrial transition, with the thought that if you can do that, then you've got some chance to use those same set of variables to think about a transition to a low-carbon system, which is generally more capital and lower or higher capital spending, but lower operating costs. So that's the idea to keep in the back of your mind. And so when I talk about long-term change of the energy transition, this graph is one that I often show to try to describe this. This is data from Roger Fouquet at the London School of Economics. This is a time series of the spending on energy of various forms that leads to these various energy services, such as power, mechanical work, and labor by humans. And then adding up all the spending on money on these energy fuels leading to these services divided by GDP. So the point here is, on the left, in an agrarian society, energy, by this metric, is expensive. It's 50 to 60% relative to GDP. Once you get to the industrial transition, kicking in the 1800s, this declines precipitously to less than 10%. And most of the economic analysis and most of the things that people are discussing when they're trying to understand an energy transition, they're focusing on basically the right 1/10 or 1/20th of this graph. And so I'm trying to put this entire chart in a context, and I'm saying, well, if I have a model that wants to understand a low carbon transition, maybe it should be able to understand this transition first and then go to the other one, and be able to understand the dynamics of this. Not just what happens at equilibrium, but how much time does it take to get there? And can I understand these time rate of changes? So to do this, we're trying to link two ideas, right? A biophysical model, something that has people are mass, or physical and biological, natural resources, and other biophysical models often have capital of some sort. Maybe it's a physical quantity, maybe they consider that, and try to link it up with, quote unquote, the simplest economic model I can think of. Economic models often have population. Maybe it's exogenous, but it's implicit in there. Capital, maybe it's in units of money instead of physical units. Wages, employment, these are the things that policymakers and people want to understand. Are you going to create jobs? Is the GDP going to grow? And sometimes including debt, depending on what sort of economic camp you're in. But I think debt is an important point to talk about, specifically because of the point I mentioned earlier, which is, if you're going to think about a renewable transition or low carbon transition, much of the investments required are basically capital intensive, relatively high capital versus operating costs, and people think, well, you're going to have to finance this and pay it off later. So you better be able to track the debts associated with paying that over time. So linking these two ideas. So I'm going to summarize the biophysical model that I use for this, and then summarize the economic model that I use for this, and then discuss some results. So the biophysical model I took here is basically a 2014 paper by Safa Motashuri, and they basically have four equations. So this, to me, was about the simplest model. Actually, you can break it down into three equations. There's a population, basically births minus deaths. I'm going to throw out one of the populations. There's a model, there's an equation for nature. Nature is treated like a forest. It has a regeneration rate of some size. It has a maximum size that I'll go over here, some of the important parameters. And then you extract it at some rate. And then there is wealth in their model, which is basically nature you've extracted, but you've not yet directly consumed, some measure of storage. So for my purposes, I will just use the three equations, and I'll highlight some of the important variables here to understand some of the parameters that go into a model like this, and that I will use later. So what are some of the finite world effects, if you will? Well, this lambda parameter here is basically the size of the world. Somewhere in the model, if you want to model whether the size of the world is important, there's a parameter in there that says how big the world is. This is the parameter for this model. So this is, say, this is the maximum size of a forest that can exist, something like that. So you set this number, I'll play with that. There's also the death rate. If you don't want to have, if you can't have infinite growth, there's going to be some feedback that tells you to stop growing, in this case population. So births are constant, but deaths are not constant. They're a function of, in their model, wealth, or this accumulated stock of resources. But in my model, I'm going to make it a function of current consumption of nature resources. So this would be like linking death rates to energy consumption per person. So essentially, death rates are a feedback. If there's not enough energy consumption per person, death rates will increase until they balance out with the births, and then you would get a steady quantity of population. There's a regeneration rate of nature, so this is basically how fast the forest grows back. Equivalently, this could be thought of as a fossil resource. You could use this technology, or this parameter, to describe technological change in terms of being able to access more fossil resources. There's sort of no real mathematical difference between a regeneration rate of a single site versus finding more resources of expanding number of sites. And there is the equation for extraction, right? What is the equation that describes how much nature you extract from the environment? And their agrarian model, SAFA, basically made it as a function of people, right? How many more people you have are farming the land in an agrarian society. This dictates how much nature you can extract. So this delta is a parameter, sort of a technological parameter to play with. X is the number of people, Y is the quantity of nature. So if you have no nature out there, you can't extract it anymore. So that's a feedback that says if it's not there, you can't extract it. And I make this as a function of capital to try to translate it to a modern sort of concept or economic concept. So instead of a function of people, I make it a function of capital and then associate labor with that capital. So that's the basic model for the biophysical model. I can answer a short question if you have one.
You're saying that the individual, it has a constant rate of consumption, it doesn't change?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay,
I haven't gone over that yet. So here's the what kind of results do you get from a model like this? This is just straight from SAFA's paper, Ecological Economics. So if you extract nature at some moderate pace, not too fast, not too slow, you end up with this nice little steady state society. You extract nature, population goes to some constant amount. The quantity of nature turns into a steady state amount, and you're extracting per year a constant amount. So everything just kind of goes along at that forever. If you extract at a very high rate, or too high of a rate, you extract nature so quickly that you deplete it before it has a chance to regenerate itself, and you end up collapsing the society. So the only point of showing this is, that's the basic concept for putting it in the model that I needed. I needed something that said you can do something too fast, basically, and you can feel the repercussions of running out of resources. So there's that aspect of the model, and that's the basic reason to include this type of framework. So what is the model really doing in terms of a modern industrial ecology model or something of a biophysical economy that we might want to describe? So this slide will go over that. So essentially, the resources like nature, we call nature, it's like a forest. As I say, in the forest, we do four things with the resources from nature. These are the four things that happen. So the top thing is there is nature that is required to operate capital, whose job it is to extract nature. So this is like it takes diesel fuel to operate a drilling rig, something like that, right? So you need fuel to do that. So this job of this capital, there's two kinds of capital, which means there's two sectors in this model, two groups of labor, two types of profits, etc. So there's one type of capital that is extraction capital. There's another type of capital that are just generically calling goods capital. They basically do everything else in the economy that you might imagine. And so there's nature required to operate this goods capital. It's like needing electricity to run a factory, or something like this. There is also consumption. Ken, if you have a really quick question.
Do you have a money capital?
I'm getting to there. So yes,
okay.
So be patient.
Okay.
Be patient. So this is a physical, in this part right here, it's a physical notion of capital. There are multiple units. I said I'll have multiple units of money and units of physical nature. So the green is units of nature. So the third thing, or the thing here at the bottom that happens is there is human consumption of nature. This would be like consuming nature or consuming food at your house or electricity in your home or something like this. So that's the third thing that happens with the resources. And the fourth thing that happens with the resources is that it becomes more capital. So if you want to make more machines or build stuff, you need to make it out of nature. So these are the four things that happen to that. And so investment, so this is essentially goods or nature embodied in investment. This investment then is of two kinds. You can either invest in capital goods, or you can invest in extraction capital, or you can invest in goods capital. So those are the two things, multiplied by the price, and you end up with a monetary value of capital here, or at least of this physical capital, which becomes more extraction capital. And again, the goods capital's job is to produce quote-unquote goods in a generic sense. These goods are investment. Whatever does not go to investment becomes household consumption. So this addresses the question of consumption. So whatever is not invested, whatever is left over from the intermediate demands of the economy, and whatever is left over for investment becomes consumption by households, and then that dictates the death rates. In this case, so on the right side there, the net output, I have no government here. There's no imports or exports, so net output is just consumption plus investment. All right, so that's the basics of what the model is doing in terms of how the flows come together. So what are the economic components here that describe things? So capital, this is somewhat standard stuff here. Capital is just investment minus depreciation. This is the rate of accumulation of capital. Debt here, the definition of debt here is investment minus profits. So if a private sector, one of the sectors, invests more than its profits, it accumulates debt. If it invests less than its profits, then it would be paying back debt. I'll use this, a simplified version of this to describe the impact of debt-based investment or private sector debt accumulation as investment. So I'm using just a simple linear model of investment as a function of profit share. So how much profits are there divided by total value added to the economy. This is basically used to determine how much investment there is. You can set this exactly equal to profits. You can set it to some other function to play with this as a sensitivity parameter. To give you some effect of what this is historically been, at least for the United States, these data here are for the United States from the Bureau of Economic Analysis tables that indicate profits and investment. On the right side is essentially this investment divided by profits, gross investment divided by profits. And you'll notice that before the 70s, it was basically 1.5. The overall economy of the United States was investing 50% more than its profits as investment. And so this would be a metric of debt, the rate of debt accumulation, and it rose up even higher from that until the mid-90s, and then dropped to a low point of 1.2%, or 1.2, so 20% more investment than profits at sort of the downturn of the global financial crisis. On the left side, this is basically plotting investment share divided by profit share. The yellow dashed line is a slope of 1. So the yellow dashed line is if you invested exactly your profit. So it basically shows the only times in which we did not invest more than profits was World War II. So that downturn there below that dashed line is World War II. And the line that is going far to the left is the Great Depression. So everything else is kind of in this upper right area, 1.5 to 2 times to 2.5 times investment relative to profits. So this is sort of what capitalists do, right? This is a capitalist economy. You're investing for the future and expect to get these returns by investing more than we're currently making. So that's how investment works. Wage, this is a sort of quasi-Phillips curve here. Basically, it says how do wages change? Wages, if you have relatively high employment above some set point that you put into the model, wages go up. The theory is that if you have more employment, then workers can bargain for more wages. Now, the slope of this curve would not be constant over time, but this is the method I'm using here just to have a feedback on what wages would be. So this dictates how wages could increase or decrease at a given time. Here is the sort of input-output table accounting, if you will, of what's going on in the model. I'm going to describe a couple of these pieces because they're important for the feedbacks that I already discussed in the conceptual flow diagram of how resources are linked to investment and consumption. So on the far right side is net output, as I said, just consumption and investment. Since it's based on a physical model and there is no monetary investment associated with the extraction sector per se, because the good sector is the one that produces capital goods. So the good sector is the one where the investment is actually a net output from that sector in a physical sense. But this is attracting flows of money. Value added is composed of four pieces. There's profits, there's wages, there is interest payments, and there is depreciation for each sector. And now we're going to go over some of these components here. So this part of the input-output table is how much nature does it take to extract nature, basically. So this is kind of one of the main EROI or net energy type pieces of the model. So how much unit does it take to extract nature from the environment? As the model here, it's basically a function of capital and capacity utilization, some technology parameters. So you would say, how much nature does it take to operate capital? I need capital to extract nature. That's the numerator. The denominator is basically the equation for extraction itself. This is probably the simplest equation you can have for how much capital would relate to extracting how much nature. This is not necessarily the most realistic, but it's maybe the most simple to put in. It has the correct feedback. So it is capital times nature. Again, if you don't have any nature, you can't extract it. If you don't have any capital, you can't extract it. And the delta is a parameter that you can play with. So that's basically the operating cost of the extraction sector in a nature sense. And then you have the nature needs for operating the goods sector. And that's composed of two pieces. The first one here is similar to the previous. It is just the nature requirements in order to operate the existing capital stock that is in the economy. And then the second one is associated with investment. So this is where the nature embodied in investment comes in. If the extractions, there is a certain amount of nature required to become whatever monetary investment goal there is. There's a certain amount of nature that's associated with that money, so in a physical sense. So that's what this, the green highlighted equation is. So it's investment in money divided by the price of energy or the price of extracted goods divided by total goods production. So those describe the flows of before. So now I'll show some results, and we can think about whether these represent something interesting in terms of the long-term trends. So this is not calibrated to a real-world economy or to the world economy, but so we can just focus on the general trends that occur here. So the idea, again, right, is to see if this model and certain parameters can mimic the agrarian to fossil transition, if you will, and throw in some ideas of play with debt-based investment to see if it enhances our understanding of what might be going on at some time. All right, so we're trying to understand this, right? Again, this is the graph I showed. We're going to try to understand this big drop in spending as a proportion of GDP, at least the spending on energy resources, energy and food resources generically. So this model is so generic that nature essentially is conceptually all of those things put together. All right, so here's how I play the little game. Start the simulation. The simulation here in this case assumes that nature's maximum size is 100 units of nature. I push go on the model. It goes to some rough steady state. And then at about 400, time 400, I say, okay, I found more resources. I invented the steam engine or something, and I was able to extract more resources, or else I discovered a new world. You know, whatever you want to conceptualize, I found more resources. What happens? Okay, the quantity of nature that I perceive available to me goes up because I found more resources. In this case, I'm saying it's 200% bigger. So instead of having a maximum size of nature of 100, I'm saying it's 300. And there are three lines charted here that I'll go through on the rest of the slides to describe some of the scenarios. The first, the dotted line here is just the only thing changed in the model is the amount of resources out there. That's the only parameter that changed from 100 to 300. And so you get a rise and a slight fall of the quantity of nature. So this is not the rate of nature extraction. This is how much nature is out there, which is different than the nature extraction. And then you say, okay, what if I have debt-based investment, which I'm basically saying, what if I invest 1.5 times my quantity of profits? Well, if you do that, then you, in this case, end up conserving a little bit of nature. You don't extract as much of it out, at least at a steady state. And then you say, okay, what if I found more resources, and I had debt-based investment, and I made capital more efficient? So basically, I made capital require less nature to operate itself. This would be like making a power plant more efficient, or making a car have a higher mile per gallon, or something like that. And so if you do that, you're able to extract more nature. Because you're more efficient at using the capital you have, you're able to basically afford to extract more nature and deplete it further. All right, so this is what's happening there. So okay, now let's look at the costs of energy. And so I have a prices of goods and prices of energy that are solved in the model. And so this is the price of nature. And we can see that before the transition, it is at some level here, say roughly 0.4. And then after we find more resources, it drops, to less than half of what it was previously, somewhere in the 0.15 range. So we have this significant drop in cost of energy, or in this case, price of energy. And all the simulations roughly falling into the same area, but we can investigate them a little bit further on the next slide. So this is the chart I'm trying to replicate the data on the right in the model, and basically claiming is essentially replicating this trend on the right by changing one or more of these parameters. Even by just increasing resources and having nothing else change in the economy, that it would just be stagnant otherwise, represents broadly this change. And so that's what I think this graph shows. So this large precipitous drop is largely caused by just having access to more resources, or having a technology that enables you to have access to more resources, not specific enough to make that distinction. And then the difference between the simulation where there's more efficient capital versus the one where the efficiency of the capital did not change is represented in between these green arrows. So again, the solid white line is if there's this increase in efficiency, and the dashed line is if there is not this increase in efficiency. So the slightly more efficient operating capital world has a slightly less price of energy than otherwise. And in the real world data, I'm pointing there to basically the post-1970s era in which efficiency became a targeted tactic after the 1970s in the Western world. Again, this graph is for England and the United Kingdom. So that's looking at the cost of energy, the price of energy, so that's pretty good. There's some other metrics that are going on here. Since I'm calculating the nature extraction rate and a number for net output, I can calculate the nature intensity or energy intensity, energy flow divided by GDP, if you will. So that's what's shown on this graph. Again, time 400, same simulation. I find more resources. On the right side is the data for the United Kingdom. The characteristic to notice for this curve, of course, is that the energy intensity goes up during the industrial transition for about 100 years. So essentially, it's not that if you want to use this as a metric of efficiency, you could say that it became less efficient, but effectively energy consumption was going up faster than GDP, but both metrics were going up rapidly. It's just that the energy consumption was going up even more rapidly. And then after roughly 1900, energy consumption was still going up and GDP was still going up, but in this case, GDP was going up faster than energy consumption. And so I look at my model and I think, well, it's got a pretty similar characteristic. At the beginning of the transition, there is a precipitous rise in nature extraction intensity. And then after some period, there's a decline in nature extraction intensity. And this nature extraction intensity can go below the previous level if I include the concept of efficiency. And of course, during the time period since the 1900s, we can imagine that machines and capital have become more nature efficient or energy efficient in terms of factories or cars or manufacturing in general, right? No one's staying stagnant during this time period. So I look at that and I say, okay, these are now two things that I think the model generally represents on a very long time scale, matching historical data. So let's look at something else here that's maybe a little bit more in the modern discussion, wage share. So in the background here, it's calculating wages and labor. So this chart shows the simulation of the wage share of value added, basically what workers were being paid. So it goes up to some number, stabilizes after you find more resources. If you look at the dotted line, if the only thing you do is find more resources, the model is saying, oh, you would have a slightly higher wage share. You're investing exactly equal to profits, so you're not accumulating debt, and so more resources translate to higher wages, higher wage share. If you have debt-based investment, you have the two other lines, which are declining at roughly a linear rate, two different rates. So basically, you're accumulating debt. In the model, interest rates don't change. So if you're accumulating debt, interest rates don't change, and eventually you get to a steady state economy, which this model is doing after time period. The interest rates become a larger and larger proportion of total value added, and if interest payments are becoming a larger proportion, the thing that takes the hit is wages, because you're going to have to deal with depreciation and you're going to mandate the interest payments, so the only thing to give way is wages. Okay, so that's what the model is doing. Here's some data from the United States. This isn't exactly wage share. If you show wage share, it actually looks much more compelling, and it almost looks like exactly like the chart I show on the left. But I don't show that because maybe it's not the correct metric to compare to the United States, or the most full metric. This is compensation share, which includes benefits like health benefits and retirement benefits going to workers and salaried people. And so this is from 1929 until roughly the present time for the United States as a percentage of gross national income. So you can see it rises until the 70s, stays flat for a couple decades, and then slightly declining after that. So how much of the total value added of the U.S. economy is going to wages and other forms of compensation for workers and salary? So the interesting thing about this is they both kind of have, at least during this transition period of extracting more resources, a sort of up and down kind of little trend. So the question is there some relationship between the ability to distribute a share of the economy to wages and basically how much interest payment you're making, which is tied to how much debt you've accumulated? And this is what I'm pontificating here. Now, the other interesting thing here is if you plot energy consumption per person in the United States, this total primary energy divided by people, you get the white line here, and the white line and the red lines are strikingly similar. So you can begin to ask yourself the question, do you actually need more resources to run factories or do stuff, build stuff, do construction, and is this what the majority of people get paid to do? And if you're not doing that, will this be an explanation for why you're not increasing the wage share, or at least able to keep it at the same level that it was, say, 20 or 20 years ago? So for mine, I don't have, here I'm plotting the nature extraction rate, not the nature extraction per person, so I'm not really trying to trick you here. I'm just showing you, I'm not showing nature extraction per person because it's not as compelling, but the model is pretty simple. So we can think to ourselves, well, what might you add to this model to make these things match up further? But this is the nature extraction rate in the model, so it would be the equivalent of total primary energy consumption. And now I superimpose the same energy consumption per person onto this chart. And you can see, okay, they both kind of rise up, stagnate to some level, and go to some steady state, right? The United States, for total primary energy consumption, has been basically consuming the same amount of primary energy since the early 2000s. So we've gone through about 15 years. This is an unprecedented time, of course, for the history of the United States, which is not that long compared to the history of man or even most other countries. But both of them kind of reached this plateau. Both of them are no longer growing in wage share. Both of them are accumulating debt and having an increase in interest payments, except if you lower the interest rate. So this would be rationale, or this model could potentially be used to understand why there would be a tendency to lower interest rates. If you accumulate debt to such a degree, you literally can't invest anymore, or you have trouble maintaining the wages at the level you have, would be a reason to lower the interest rates to hold back total interest payments. So other simulation results of interest here. So here's population on the left, total capital on the right. If you find more resources, they go up. If you get more efficient at consuming them in an operational efficiency sense, then both of them can accumulate further. In some sense, if you don't need as much resources to operate the capital and to keep alive the people that you have, then you can accumulate more people and more capital. Maybe sort of a Jevons paradox idea. If you get more efficient, you get more stuff. On the left is this insurance payment share. So this is just sort of indicating, yeah, if you're accumulating debt, and again, I'm not having any change in interest rates, then the interest payment share of the economy, once it gets to a steady level, is increasing. On the right is total net output, so consumption plus investment. On the bottom again is if you find resources, more resources only. The next dashed line is if you find more resources and you have debt-based investment. I think there was a question earlier, what about the finance sector? Well, the finance sector makes it appear as though you have more net output, even though the physical flow may be pretty similar, which it was in this case. And then the solid dashed line on the right is if you have debt-based investment and you're more efficient. So this would be reasons if this model represents the general capitalistic tendency of the economy to show, yeah, why you would pursue efficiency and why you might pursue debt-based investment if GDP is one of your metrics of success. You can plot net energy ratio. So this is what I call the net external power ratio because it's a ratio of the nature flow during that year divided by the nature flow inputs to from the extraction sector that year. So this is essentially nature extracted minus the nature that is required to operate capital minus the nature that's required to go into embodied capital, or that becomes embodied in capital. And so it goes up if you find more resources, and if you get more efficient, it goes up again. So I think that's no surprise that if you have more efficient capital operation, that your net external, or EROI, or net external power ratio, you perceive as going up. Wages per person, so this is inherently getting calculated. Here's the wages. The wages go up for a while you're extracting more resources at a high rate, and then once you approach the area of steady state or a slower extraction of resources and then reach a steady state extraction of resources, this is when the wages go down and end up at a steady rate. And again, here's the nature extraction rate on the right. So what are the takeaways from this? So this is a two-sector model. This is in this post-Keynesian sort of formulation, trying to mix that with some, I guess, in my attempt, the fewest biophysical parameters that I might need to link these ideas together, and it's basically physical capital, people, and some resource, some environmental resource that is required to operate the economy. By doing this, I can replicate, broadly speaking, the fossil to, or the agrarian to fossil energy transition in the UK, and the cost of that. I can explain the cost and the energy intensity of that. And potentially this can also help us understand the post-1970s wage share decline that's happening in the US and most other OECD countries that is perplexing economists and central banks around the world. And by the way, so in here there's no exogenous growth assumption, right? So there's no assumed exogenous labor productivity growth or total factor productivity growth. This is all what you see is what you've got here. Of course, you can always add that in if you would like. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have time for questions.
Questions? Yes.
Quick question. The availability, the jump in the availability of resources, it was instantaneous? So you didn't include, for example,
No.
a transition from
No, it was not.
reserve resource to reserve and then...
Right, I don't define a resource or a reserve in the model, but I did not make it instantaneous because the results have various jumps. So yeah, there's a delay of 50 years. If you're in the vernaculars, a third order delay with a 50-year time constant. So I'm essentially, in some sense, exogenously determining the time rate of change of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's not, otherwise it changes too quickly and looks kind of weird.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The debt you're using is the debt related to capital investment and not the debt related to the fact that people need a mortgage to buy a house or a car, and the fact that people now have to borrow money to go to school, and we have umpteen other kinds of things, and these things also have interest, and they also send money up to the financial.
Right, so the simplicity of the model right now is, there's no capital that's owned by people or households in this model. So that would be a very good thing, and it's sort of obvious good thing to add to the model. Consumption's also not dictated by anything other than what's left over after you invested from the net output. So consumption just magically takes everything else at the moment. So that would be it's a change that I'm working on to add. Yep.
Why do you use the concept of nature when you, in practice, use energy?
Because the model is so generic now that it doesn't only mean energy, I guess. I mean, if I extracted a mineral or wood, if I used, the wood from a forest to build a house, conceptually in the model it would be the same thing. So I don't have to use nature for the purposes of energy. It becomes this computer, it becomes this building, or in the model it's so simple that it could either be this computer, this building, or I could have burned it. Or wood, for example. So it's just too generic.
Energy and other nature.
I think
energy and stuff.
Yeah, I think John mentioned it. I mean, there's things we do with biomass, and it's not just one thing. So in this model, it's conceptually saying you could potentially do all those things with it.
So the handy model includes the percentage of elites versus non-elites. What was your thought process in not using that?
That I wanted the simplest model to start with to get something done. So one thing, when I guess economists say, okay, you've got household consumption. Well, there's not one kind of household. So one of the, I think, quote-unquote obvious things to add to the model is put the elites back in, make the elites the people that basically get the interest payments as their income, and make the commoners the people that only get the wages, and then you could start to play that dynamic. And if you add household consumption in terms of accumulating debt to be able to consume resources, then you're starting to really add a lot of pieces to the puzzle.
Polly?
I just had a question about the wage share. So do you think it's more of a function of who accumulates and how wealth is accumulated in society? Right now, why that share has not increased rather than a physical thing? simply how the rules are set right now, of who gets paid, and how surplus value is accumulated?
Right, so I think it's as you say, and the model here, you have some assumption for what the investment behavior is. This investment behavior is defined by whatever the rules are in the economy, and right now that investment behavior is quite simple. Well, you can just, it's a function of profit share, and by dictating that it invests more than profits, you get that result. So then we can ask, okay, is the economy set up to basically enable capitalists to do that? And it's okay, and they get bailed out or get away with it. These are all other kinds of things. But the other question is, even if you have debt-based investment, you don't get a decline in wage share until the rate of extraction of resources starts to slow down and stagnate. So for a time period, you can avoid the wage share decline, but after you stagnate in resource consumption, even with that same investment rule, that's when you're going to get the decline in wage share. So I think that's the translation to what's going on in the real world, as witnessed by the energy consumption per person flatlining. If that was still going up, then we'd hypothesize, no, the wage share could have stayed high. Yeah.
Okay, you and then you, and then you.
So just one question. It looked like your EROI for extracting nature stagnated at a 50 to 1 level or something. We move back to that.
Yeah, it goes to some constant level and stays there. Steady state number of some kind.
So basic, I just, to understand your model better, there's not a there's a regeneration rate on nature, but there's not really a depletion that says the nature's getting harder and harder to extract. That's not in the model? I'm just asking.
Both parts are in the model.
Okay.
As you deplete nature, it gets harder to extract.
Okay.
But once you, at some steady state, however hard it is to extract, the economy has just become tuned to that.
Okay.
So there's the simplistic way, it's basically 1 over the quantity of nature that dictates the difficulty of extracting it. So as nature gets depleted, the denominator gets closer and closer to 0. And so that means you start to need an infinite amount of resources to extract out the last bit. So that keeps it from extracting everything. But that's, as I said, probably the simplest way you can possibly think about it. And so there's other functions you can put in there to try to match to more real world situations.
Which you should.
You?
I'm a research forester. I'm locked in a mining economy. It appears that the maintenance economy can't be funded with the current banking regulations, but its yields are much higher than the normal maintenance, the normal mining economy is. I think this is similar to finding new resources.
I'm not sure your question, so I don't have
I think you've answered the question in there, but the maintenance economy has been, we've not been allowed to test it.
Well, in this sense, there is, you can sort of model the banking behavior. In the model here, essentially, if a private company or one of these sectors wants money, the bank essentially gives it to them. It's kind of the assumption
It makes
of the
it
model.
out of thin air.
Right. That's what's, that's
is-
inherent in that's money creation in the model. So that's inherent in this framework.
Yeah, but it damages everyone else.
Right. So in the model, there's just the population. So that becomes the next.
Okay,
One of the next step is to say, okay, there's this wages, but how many people is it really going to?
There's
Right?
a
How would you?
significant sector of our economy that goes into driving trucks to
Right.
move stuff around, and Google is now putting driverless trucks on interstates.
Right.
At some point, I think the amount of wages that are going to go to people is going to drop precipitously.
Right. So if you run this model to the end, that's basically what happens if you have debt-based investment. You basically take the wage share to 0 eventually. Right. So that's the end game of the model. If you assume that you invest more than debt in a steady state extraction world, that's the end result that comes out. That's not from the model, it's sort of inherent in the assumptions.
No? Okay. Gail?
Oh, I was just going to observe that there's diminishing returns to complexity, which is one thing that would argue against flatlining.
Well, I mean, we're not an economy living off of a forest doing everything we have, right? So you could put 0 regeneration right here, and you would not get this steady state extraction. It would drop off and go to 0 eventually. So all you have to do in this model is put extraction rate equal to 0, and you have a fossil economy resource, and then you can play it out from there.
AJ?
Just a quick question. I missed the beginning of your presentation. Sorry about that. When you say debt-based investment, are you just talking about taking a loan?
Yes, that a private sector would invest more than its profits, and in doing so takes out a loan from a bank. And
Okay.
banks create money to give them that extra.
And we're talking about private sector specifically, not like.
The only debt in here is a private company, yeah, private sector debt. That's the only kind in this model.
Michelle? I appreciate the simplicity of your model. Where do you plan on taking it from here?
I think to try to answer some of these questions brought up, let consumers own capital. In some sense, I think there's normal things that economists add to this model: a central bank, a government, ability to some feedback on interest rates, capital by people, which allows them to accumulate debt, tying the consumption to wages or their income instead of just making it whatever's left over from that investment. Those are probably the basic economic things to change, and then the physical things to change are to put in a renewable energy sector, something that represents something like solar and wind, put in a fossil sector, and add it to this, which is kind of like a renewable stock sector, and then you have three basic resource type flows, one fossil stock, one regenerating stock, and one flow. So that's the intermediate end goal I hope for. Then you could also add a climate thing on here to make it an integrated assessment model. So yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, that's the amount of time we have for this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carey.